shadow of death, to guide our feet in the way of peace. This is the second Sunday in Advent. Advent is the season, the 4 weeks before Christmas, which allow us to kind of find times, or challenge us maybe to find times apart from the busy preparations to reflect on the story of Christmas, to reflect on the first Christmas, to reflect on this God who left from heaven to be with us in the form of a baby, vulnerable, hungry, needy. God did that. God leapt from heaven to be with us. Last week we talked about hope. This week we're talking about peace. When the angel appeared to Mary, he said, "Fear not, or peace be with you, O favored one." Mary, for those who don't know, is the mother of Jesus. Mary was not a princess. Mary was not the daughter of a wealthy landowner. Mary was not much of anything. She was a female. She was unmarried, though she was betrothed to a man named Joseph. She was dirt poor. She came from a dirt poor family, and she lived in a dirt poor region, the region of Nazareth, who later on somebody said of Jesus, how could anything good come out of Nazareth? Mary was one of the lowest of the low, at least in the kingdom of that time, because the Hebrew people were under the yoke, under Rome. They were captives in their own country, really. So Mary was really, she was nothing according to any of the standards that we have of something. She wouldn't have been an influencer on today's Instagram. She wouldn't have even had a phone. She might not have even had lunch. This is important. It's important for us to know this, that Mary was not anything special until this conversation, when an angel appeared to her and said, "Peace be with you, favored one." And Mary looked at the angel in confusion, right? The angel went on to tell her that God would come upon her and she would bear a son, and that son would be named Jesus, and that he would be the salvation of the entire world. And Mary was an eminently practical peasant girl. And she heard that. She thought about it, and she said to the angel, "How can that be? Because I'm a virgin." And you know what? The angel answered her. The angel didn't punish her for asking a question. The angel said, "The power of the Lord will come upon you, and you will be with child." And we don't understand it, and a lot of people don't believe it. A lot of people, the whole virgin birth is something that many people, even in the church, wrestle with because it seems so crazy. What the heck? We're just like Mary. We know where babies come from, right? They don't just pop up. Right? And then the angel said this, "For Mary with God, anything is possible." Now, on Wednesday nights, the Faith Journeys group has been watching this series of videos called The Christmas Experience. And let me tell you, if you want to see Christmas with new eyes, talk to me afterwards and I'll give you the link, because these videos are powerful. And so the scene that I just described to you is one of the scenes we see in the videos. In the first video, though, we see Mary and Joseph bumping into each other and falling in love, and we see them being betrothed. And then in the second video, it opens with this conversation between Mary and the angel. Peace be with you. And the video shows, we see Mary walking around with this smile on her face as she embraces the promises that God has made to her and realizes that God can do anything and celebrates it. And then at one point she stops and her expression changes. You see, there's another person involved in this. She's betrothed to a man, Joseph. How does she tell Joseph? What you don't know. There's so much when we read the few verses that talk about Mary and talk about Joseph and talk about their journey. What gets left out, and it's really important for us to know, is that to be an unmarried, pregnant woman in that community, in the Hebrew community, was to risk stoning, to risk death. Peace be with you. I'm going to give you a baby you can't explain, and it might get you killed. Peace be with you. Mary holds on to that promise, and she goes to Joseph, and she tries in this conversation with him to tell him about the appearance of the angel, and the conversation gets all muddled, and she gets more and more frustrated because she loves this man and she wants him to know what's going to happen, and she wants him to know that God told her and that this is a thing that is promised. This huge thing that can fill her life with such joy is something that God has promised her and them. But she doesn't tell Joseph. Instead, she goes to visit her aunt, or her cousin Elizabeth, who the angel had told her was in her 6th month of pregnancy, this woman who was old and beyond childbearing years. So that her cousin Elizabeth had also had a promise and was now pregnant with that child. And so Mary went to Elizabeth. And as soon as she arrived, Elizabeth knew. Elizabeth celebrated her pregnancy and said, "When you called out your greeting, the baby within me leapt with joy." And so for a number of months, Mary stayed there with Elizabeth until John was born, who had been promised as a prophet who would go before Jesus. So she was given the gift of someone who had a similar experience and whose company she could rest in to find peace in the midst of this situation. And she found that peace in the promises. She found that peace in the promises. And Elizabeth found that peace in God's promises to her. But the problem was, eventually Mary had to go home. And by the time she went home, she was a number of weeks or months pregnant. And it was obvious. And then we see a scene between Joseph, who's happily preparing the small house he's bought for him and his betrothed to live in after she's born, and Eli, Mary's father. And Eli comes up, and Joseph comes down to greet him, and Eli grabs his lapels and says, "How dare you dishonor her like this? How dare you? And Joseph is thrown away, and you promised me, Eli said, you promised me that you would care for her and you would love her and that you would not dishonor her. And Joseph is becoming more and more baffled. He doesn't know what Eli is talking about. And Eli goes on, did you think that no one would know? Did you think that everyone would just ignore the fact that she has a baby growing inside her? Did you just think nobody would notice? And Joseph's face becomes more and more bewildered because he doesn't know what Eli is talking about. But those words catch him, and he turns around and looks at Eli and says, baby? She's with child? And Eli says, how can you even ask that? How could you even ask that? Of course she's with child. She's carrying your child. And Joseph said, I don't question that she's with child, but it's not my child. Feel that for a minute. That moment of absolute betrayal. And Eli says, well then, whose child is it? And Joseph says, I don't know. And he takes off his apron and throws it down in the dirt, but he says, we're about to find out. And he marches off. And they burst into the front room of Eli's house, and Joseph calls Mary, and she's there, and she struggles to get up, and her belly is already big, and she stands there and looks at him. She looks into the face of one whose love has been betrayed, who believes her to have laid with another man, who believes this baby to be the son of another human being. And she stands there, this peasant girl with very little power. She stands there and looks at him, and he says, whose baby is it? And she says, an angel came to me and told me that I would have a child, and that God would come upon me and I would become pregnant, and that this baby would be the hope of all the world. Can you imagine? It's a big one to get your head around. As the betrayed husband, as the dishonored father. Can you imagine? Babies don't just spring into being. There's always two. They know that. But she stands and she, with as much dignity and grace as she can, holding on to the promise that God has made, and the knowledge that anything is possible with God. Mary stands her ground and repeats her story as Joseph questions her. And the second time she tells it, Eli, who's standing off in a corner, yells, blasphemy! This word shall not come out of your mouth. This is a lie. It's wrong. You know better. And Mary, a teenage peasant girl, stands her ground in the face of the two men that she loves most in all the world. And she said, an angel came to me, and he told me that God would come upon me and I would be pregnant, and that child would be the hope of the whole world. And at that, Eli leaves. And Joseph looks at Mary and says, don't you know you could be stoned? Who is the man? Who is it? She says, Joseph, you have to. And he says, I don't have to do anything. And he walks out of the house. And then we see Joseph struggling with it. Struggling with the anguish of the betrayal. Struggling with this improbable story. Come on. Right? We see him struggling with it. And then something happens to Joseph. And then something happens to Joseph. And what happens is an angel appears to him. And it says, be not afraid. Peace be with you. Joseph, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, because what she tells you is true. This child is of God and is the hope of the whole world. And we see Joseph startle awake, and we see this wonder come across his face as the impact of that dream registers. He hasn't been betrayed. She's telling the truth. Oh my gosh, she needs me. And so he goes in the middle of the night. He goes directly to Mary's house. He bangs on the door. He wakes up Eli. He pushes past Eli and he calls out to Mary. And Mary comes out of the back room where the family is sleeping. And he falls on his knees and wraps his arm around her and puts his face against her belly and says, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. And Mary says, Joseph, what has happened to you? And all Joseph can say is the one thing that Mary hadn't told him, but he had heard from the angel. He said, we shall name him Jesus, and he is the hope of the whole world. That moment hasn't changed anybody else's perception of Mary or of Joseph. By believing the angel's story, Joseph has now stepped into that place of being dishonored and questioned and right alongside Mary. And there's a hasty wedding ceremony where the rabbi can hardly look at him as he's performing the message. And as he says, Mazel Tov, he runs away. And then Mary and Joseph look to her parents and they both shake their heads and turn away. Peace be with you. Peace be with you. Nobody's going to believe you. Peace be with you. You're going to be doubted and dishonored and questioned and cast out. Peace be with you. But the peace that they had was based on God's promises, not based on the situation they found themselves in, not based on the reaction of the people around them, not based on anything except for the promise that with God anything was possible, and that this child that she was carrying would be named Jesus, and he would be the hope of the whole world, would save the world from their sins, and would guide them in the path of peace. The weeks leading up to Christmas are often not very peaceful, are they? Anybody here have busy weeks leading up to Christmas? Come on. Show of hands, busy weeks, lots of preparations, or if you work in retail, it's gotten crazy, and everybody's there and they all want it now, right? Or if you're in the shop, you're one of those wrestling with the people who are impatient, or maybe you're the impatient one. We're like that. There's not a lot of peace. This story reminds us that peace isn't out there. Peace is an inside job. It comes based on the promises God makes to walk with us and love us and turn our hearts around and show us a new way. And our receiving that peace, that gift of peace, requires that we believe the promises, that we believe the one who speaks them. We believe that those promises that we read all through the Bible are for us. And more than that peace requires us to participate. Requires us to live as people who bring peace. Live as people who make peace. Live as people who choose peace. They require action. It's not enough just to ask God to guide us in the path of peace. We also have to take that guidance and be peace where we can. And we can. We can. Because God promised us that Jesus Christ came to guide our feet in the path of peace. Amen.